the Rambler Network.
Good morning! Welcome back to The Digressor. I'm Trevor, and in this episode, I'm talking about Darby Crash. If you notice, my voice isn't the way it normally sounds. Well, okay, so I was going to record the last episode and this episode back to back, but while editing that episode, I realized, my voice, it's not, it was like, I knew my voice was, I knew I had been coughing a lot. I was like, it didn't affect my voice. And then I listened to myself while editing. I'm like, So that's when I did that intro, like, hey, just so you know. And I was going to wait until my voice was better to record the next episode, this one. But I've only gotten worse. And I'm actually recording this a few hours before it's supposed to go live, actually. Normally, I have these recorded weeks ahead of time, or at least 2 weeks ahead of time. This time, I basically have to record this, edit it, and instead of scheduling it, I'm probably just posting it. It might not be right at midnight. So if this is, of course, a vast majority of people that are hearing this, it'll be like way past the date. I doubt there's anybody waiting at midnight every other Sunday going, hey, when's the episode going up? And like it goes up at like 12:30. They're like, hey, what's wrong? Like, no one's paying attention. But that's why my voice sounds the way it does. There's a reason I know why I'm not sick, technically. I've been coughing. It's a whole thing. It's a long story. Anyway, so Darby Crash. I've been wanting to cover this story for a long time. I remember how I said this podcast was partially based on a blog that I used to have. It's the same blog that Casablanca started in, and I had a series that ran way longer than Casablanca. Some of the episodes in this season I've been pulling from that. In fact, most of the episodes in this season I've been pulling from that. I covered this in that, and I didn't put a lot of detail. There was like one aspect of his story that I wanted to cover back then, and that's the only thing I covered. This time, I know a little bit more about his life, and I've seen a movie about him, and they made a movie in 2007 called What We Do Is Secret, and I saw that, and it's really good, and I don't know how accurate it is. It seems accurate based on what I know, which, granted, I only know what I've seen online. And, everything online is true. So, Darby Crash was born Jan Paul Beam. Actually, I've never heard this said out loud. And all the times I've researched him, I've never heard it said out loud. No one ever uses his real name. At first he used the name Bobby Penn, and then he changed it to Darby Crash, which is what everyone knows him by, and that's what I'll be using for the rest of this episode. So it doesn't really matter if I can pronounce his actual last name. But he was born September 26, 1958. in Los Angeles. And he was the founder of a band called Germs. Alright, so it's the late 1970s in LA. A city simmering with creative unrest. The punk scene is in its infancy, a wild response to the bloated excess of mainstream rock. Kids are rejecting polished sound and slick production in favor of raw energy and nihilism. And right at the center of this cultural eruption were the Germs. But to understand the Germs, you have to understand Darby Crash. His early life was marked by instability and trauma. His father died when he was young, and his mother struggled with addiction. And his older brother, Bobby, also died. Darby was drawn to extremes from an early age. He took inspiration from fascist ideology, not because he necessarily believed in it, but because he was fascinated by the concept of controlling people through chaos and fear. In high school, he met George Ruthenberg, and the two bonded over their shared love of music and subversion. In 1977, they formed the Germs with bassist Lorna Doom and drummer Don Bolez. Okay, I feel like I should know how to pronounce this because he's actually still I think he's still drumming in bands. Anyway, they could barely play their instruments at first. In fact, their first live show was so disastrous, it ended almost immediately when Darby smeared peanut butter all over himself and the venue's equipment. But that reckless confrontational energy became their signature. Their debut single, Forming, was recorded in George's garage and released in 1977. It was rough, sloppy, and barely held together, but it captured the essence of punk, raw, unfiltered expression. Despite, or maybe because of, their chaotic live shows, they began to attract a devoted following in the LA scene. So, I was gonna have this be a plot twist at the end, but I'm just gonna say it right now. George Ruthenberg is not the name that he went by. Darby Crash gave everyone stage names, and the one that he gave George Ruthenberg is one that I'm sure a lot of people would know, or at least fans of rock. And the name he gave him was Pat Smear. And if you don't recognize that name, I will explain at the end. I will also say that Belinda Carlisle was there at the very beginning. She was a drummer for the Germs at the very beginning, but she quickly left. She went on to be the lead singer of the Go-Go's. So, she made a name for herself completely independent of Darby Crash and the Germs. It's just kind of like you hear their story and you're like, oh, what's she doing there? That's random. Anyway, in 1979, the Germs released their only studio album, GI, which was produced by Joan Jett. And it was fast, abrasive, and uncompromising. Darby's lyrics were dark and cryptic. hinting at his inner turmoil and his obsession with control and destruction. But Darby himself was spiraling. He struggled with heroin addiction and became increasingly erratic. His fixation with control extended to his own life. He talked openly about his plan to die young and cement his legacy. And then on December 7th, 1980, he and his friend Casey Cola made a suicide pact. Darby injected himself with a fatal dose of heroin, and Casey survived. Darby was only 22 years old. Now, there's a theory that I've heard. I've heard people dispute it. I've heard people prove it. I don't know what to believe. The theory is that he did this because he felt like if he took his own life, that would make his band like legendary status or something like that. That was his mindset, supposedly. Unfortunately, if you know anything about music history, and when I said December 7th, 1980, you immediately know what that means. He did that, and then John Lennon was assassinated, and that took over the news. The Germs were basically over as soon as they began, but their influence on punk was profound. Pat Smear actually went on to play with Nirvana and later became the guitarist of the Foo Fighters. That's where you probably heard his name. So, the Germs existed from like 1976 to 1980. And then in 2005, they reformed. And the movie I talked about, What We Do Is Secret, it starred Shane West as Darby Crash. And apparently he was really good at playing the character because the original members actually reformed the band with him as their lead, and they continued the band for a few years, and then Shane West had other commitments because he's an actor, and so they had to stop in 2009, and they reformed briefly in 2013. Unfortunately, Lorna Doom passed away in 2019. So that's not. I don't think they're going to reform again. Like Pat's still around. He's still the guitarist of Foo Fighters, and Shane's still doing acting. In fact, when they were touring together with Shane, they actually did a couple of Warped tours. So like they weren't just like playing a couple gigs here and there, like, oh, this is fun. They actually like went on tour. So like it was like a legit like reforming of the band. Another thing that was it was touched on briefly in the movie, and I actually watched the documentary tonight. Well, up until their point, there is a documentary called "The Decline of Western Civilization." The director, Penelope Spheris, I believe that's how you pronounce her last name. She's in so they had got someone to play her part. Like she walked in the movie "What We Do Is Secret." she walks up to him and is like, "Hey, I'm filming a documentary and I want you to be in it. It's called Decline of Western Civilization." And he's like, "Okay." And so basically what they do in this documentary is they they film, like, she filmed like punk bands in the LA scene in the late 70s. It was actually released a couple months before he passed away. So, yeah, and then they actually featured him on the cover and the posters and everything. But funny story about her. The name Penelope Spheris looked familiar when I was looking at this. I'm like, why do I know that name? And so, like, I looked on her Wikipedia and her filmography, and the reason I recognize her name is because she was the director of Wayne's World. But I digress.
The Rambler Network.